Welcome back to RotoQL University. We're wrapping up our NFL strategy course with tight ends, kickers, and defense selection for tournaments.
I'm
Sahil, what's
excited to
going
do this one and to be done with these videos.
on? Yeah, a lot of good tips in here. Tight ends, kickers, and defenses. In tournaments, it's an interesting topic to finish up. So excited what you
Yeah.
have to say.
No, it's very much important differentiator, and not as much research has been done into these positions as some of the others, so they are interesting.
Yep. Let's start with tight ends. Heading into the overview.
Yeah, so again, this is for DraftKings, so we'll see the salary of a tight end is obviously the lowest. Um, they have pretty steady variance in terms of compared to running backs and wide receivers, although it is a bit higher. You'll see the average points is a lot lower, and then the dollars per point is in between wide receivers and running backs. We'll see that stacking is a very common and important into tournament strategy, and we'll see a lot of people stack QBs and tight ends. This can be a differentiator for you since most people stack QBs and wide receivers. So doing the QB and a tight end can give you a little bit of an edge on the low owned side. Tight ends and wide receivers are also used some, but this is something that I don't recommend as much as doing a tight end and a QB. FanDuel will see this QB, wide receiver, and tight end. That's a very interesting stack. Um, this allows you to capitalize on situations where a QB may throw for multiple touchdowns, which is necessary for you to win a GPP. And if one of those goes to a tight end, you'll get a leg up. QB tight end is also pretty common. And again, just like on DraftKings, this being lower owned can be a pretty viable strategy. Tight end ownership is generally pretty pretty more clustered compared to wide receivers and running backs, and that's simply because tight end there are not that many good tight ends. So if we look at this here, we can see that there are three tight ends who make up over half the ownership, or not over half, but close to half of the ownership. Jimmy Graham, Donnell, and Kelsey. Um, what we can take away from this is that there is a lot of value to going a little different on tight ends, especially in tournaments, because tight ends will catch touchdowns. A lot of them get the majority of their fantasy output from touchdowns if you take away some of the top players. So we can really kind of leverage that information. Again, in cash games, there's, as we talked about, there's only a few that are going to be able to put up consistent points. So we can see Kelce, Donnell, and Jimmy Graham all had good matchups this week, and all are on one of the more consistent side, which leads to their higher ownership. So let's jump into kickers. So we'll see that stacking defense and kickers and running back and kickers happens fairly frequently. I don't think that there's anything to do with an edge here. I think this is just random. There is little correlation between kickers and running backs. And in fact, if your running back is scoring a touchdown, that's going to be lowering your field goal opportunities. Kicker ownership, we'll see, is generally pretty clustered around the lower priced players. As we talked about in cash games, it's generally a good strategy to kind of target cheaper kickers. The one exception for this may be a kicker who is kicking it mile high, which can get a lot of long field goals. What we'll see here is that a lot of the kickers that are higher owned, Shane Graham, Robbie Gould, Sean Sweesum, they're all below 5K. So that's something that I'll recommend, but you can definitely get a little bit of an edge by going a little different on your kickers. You see that Scobie, Patrick Murray, all the same price as Shane Graham, but their ownership is significantly lower. Let's jump into defenses. So you'll see that defenses actually have the lowest dollars per fantasy point and the highest variance. And as we discussed in the cash game deck, this is because defenses are more reliant on touchdowns than any other position. Running back in the defense is a pretty popular stack, and for a good reason. If your defense is performing well, they're going to not allow a lot of points. Your team is probably going to have the lead, which is going to lead to more running back carries, hopefully running back touchdowns. So there's a definite correlation between those two, running backs and defenses. So that's definitely something that you can take advantage of in your tournament lineups. So we'll see that with defenses, there's generally going to be a few chalky defenses, and that's generally going to be the teams that are the biggest favorites. We'll see that the Detroit Lions, 23% is very, very high, given that there are 32 options on a full slate, and generally there's going to be at least 28 different defenses you can choose from. So to see that that high in ownership lets you kind of makes you want to dig a little deeper to see if there's some under-owned defenses out there. And since we looked at the variance being the highest of all the positions, you can generally kind of try to take advantage of the high variance and higher ownership to pick a defense that is on the lower owned side that may put up a touchdown. What we'll see from FanDuel salaries is that they're definitely pricing their salaries based on Vegas totals and for both the kicker and the defense, and we'll see that there's a definite correlation between FanDuel kicker salaries and FanDuel defensive salaries. And so that the kickers are generally going to all be priced slightly higher than the defenses. This is something that we can take a look at in terms of figuring out opportunities where defenses are definitely projected to do better than their Vegas total implies. So again, let's take a look at a tournament lineup. This was from last year, and we can see that shows the Redskins defense, who was around 15% owned, was definitely a little more on the chalkier side, but had a very low salary. And that's because it was priced in that Dallas wasn't going to score as much. Was going to score a few points, but this was and had the strongest offensive line in the league. Yet this was the backup QB with Romo out there, so we were able to pick them. They didn't get too many sacks, but they were able to keep Dallas in a modest point total to keep an acceptable score. You definitely want to have more than that if you're planning on winning a GPP with your defense, potentially a touchdown. And then targeted Scott Chandler, whose ownership was pretty high, but it was in a very good spot, and that's because Gronk was injured, so the backup tight end was going to put up a decent score and definitely more than you need from that price point, which was getting a touchdown in 61 yards.
So Sahil, I know this is just one lineup example, but you seem to have Chandler and the Redskins defense in both your cash game and tournament lineups. Is there any specific reason for picking both of these players at those positions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just because Chandler was such an elite play this week, I wasn't focused too much on differentiating that. And again, I thought the Redskins defense was in a great position with the backup QB. That's primarily the reason, and this was a higher stakes tournament. So you don't need to go as contrarian there. But there's definitely situations where there's not as much obvious plays, so you want to definitely differentiate it and try to go a little more contrarian there.
Got it.
Yep, definitely take advantage of our resources. The Zendesk is a great way to learn more about RotoQL, QL Wire. We have a lot of good, interesting articles, and check out the rest of the videos on RotoQL University.